current platform and passion, specifically in YWAC, our focus is on representation and projection, how the world views young women, and especially young women of color, defining your voice again and knowing your best self, knowing what makes you hone in on your power is most important. In the past, I was actually in a troubled family environment, so I never thought that my voice was really valued. I never saw aspirational imagery that inspired me from where I was at the present time to a potentially satisfying future. In YWAC, we can reinstill that and ensure that young women of color especially are able to know that they have value, know that there's someone out there that looks like them and that they're making opportunities and spaces.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our session, Systems Change Through Centering the Leadership of Young Women of Color. I'm Mary Valadez. I'm the Associate Vice President at the Texas Women's Foundation. One of our panelists, Tony Wilson, has a quote on her email that I just love, and I want to share it with you. It says, "I did not know that feminism is what you called it when Black warrior women moved mountains and walked on water. Growing up in their company, I considered these things ordinary." And that's Joan Morgan. I think this captures the spirit of the Young Women's Initiative. The program is about young women of color in our neighborhood, in our cities, in our state. Every day they do amazing things. They get up, they go to school, they go to work, they look for work. And their lived experience, though, is not a barrier. Their lived experience is actually a resource. It is the resource from which they draw to make things possible, to make things happen, and to make things real. The young women of color, they know the solutions that need to be addressed to remove structural barriers that affect them and their peers in the community. But these barriers don't just show up when they're adults, you know. So imagine the knowledge and the wisdom that they have. We need to listen to them. We need to support them. We need to encourage them to act. And that is what 9 women's foundations did and forming the National Collaborative of Young Women's Initiatives. And this amplifies the voices of young women of color and centers the leadership of young women of color. This includes the Texas Women's Foundation, the New York Women's Foundation, the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, and coast to coast from California to DC, Western Massachusetts, and south to Birmingham, to Memphis, and to Mississippi. It is the first national collaborative of its kind. We collectively invest so that we can strengthen the future, we can strengthen the health, the well-being, the economic prosperity for young women of color. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that when I use the term young women of color, that I'm talking about cisgender and transgender young women. So joining me today are friends. We have friends joining for a discussion, and they are Iris Andrade, the Young Women's Initiative of Dallas, and Rayi Gesassi from the Young Women's Initiative of Minnesota, and Tony Wilson, who was the Director of Organizing for Girls for Gender Equity. They'll each introduce themselves briefly in a little bit, but let's start. Welcome, Tony. Girls for Gender Equity. It is a major influencer and thought leader in the arena of justice for girls. Tell us about the work of GGE and how that relates to the work of the National Collaborative of Young Women's Initiatives.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning. So good to see all of you. I can absolutely do all those things. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Tony Wilson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Organizing at Girls for Gender Equity, which is a nonprofit intergenerational based organization based in Brooklyn, New York. Here in Brooklyn, we lead city, state, and federal policy, advocacy, and civic engagement work, specifically centering Black girls, girls of color, trans, and non-binary youth of color. Yeah, let's get into the YWI Her story. I can take us all the way back to a little bit before 2011, right? Here in New York City, we had our former mayor, Bloomberg, and I'm going to try to keep this really short to 2 minutes. We had a specific policy here called stop and frisk. For those who aren't familiar with that, it was basically a policy that allowed police to stop and frisk Black, brown communities, whoever they deemed to be suspicious. There would be no need or like no reason for you to need anything before you stop and frisk them. It just allowed you to stop and frisk folks who you thought were suspicious, right? And during that time of his mayoral seat, we saw that the evidences of like police brutality and folks who were experiencing incarceration were just skyrocketing, specifically in Black and brown communities. So Bloomberg took it upon himself in 2011 to start this project called the Young Men's Initiative as a way to say, hey, y'all, I'm not racist. I promise I love Black people. I promise I love brown people. You know, what politics happen in the city when that sort of thing goes down. So he started the Young Men's Initiative, which was basically this phenomenal initiative that he launched in 2011 that seeded and developed new programs and partnerships with philanthropy that were able to house the needs of boys and men of color, specifically here in New York City. Flashing all the way down to 2014, we saw that our former President Obama, he took the YMI model and really made it into a national scale when he launched My Brother's Keeper, right? And that was his way of seeding programs nationally for young men and boys of color. But however, in this specific moment, racial and gender justice advocates were noticing like, wow, there's 3 generations of Black women and Black girls in the White House, and President Obama isn't, doing anything to support and drive the leadership of girls of color, right? So we started to take notice of there's things going on. And while we love that public and private sectors are getting together to rally around racial justice, specifically around men and boys, it's always like, okay, well, what about the girls? What about the women? What about the gender expansive folks? Where do they lie in this racial justice conversation? That kind of sparked a call to action from GGE, our CEO and founder, Joanne N. Smith. She joined forces with Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the founder of African American Policy Forum, and who fabulously coined the term that we know and that allows us to speak about our lived experiences, intersectionality. They hosted 2 town halls here in New York City called Breaking the Silence and In Plain Sight. And those 2 town halls were really able to gather young women of color, GNC folks of color, young people, for them to share about their experiences around racial and gender inequity as they navigate institutions and their interpersonal life, right? And as women of color, as girls of color, we know that our lived experiences are directly impacted by policy, philanthropy, government, all those things. So that was a specific space curated where we had philanthropy in the space. We had practitioners, teachers, social workers, counselors, government leads, city council, all in one space to listen to the needs of girls and women of color and GNC folks. And from there, in 2015, it was launched. The Why We Can't Wait campaign was launched here in New York City and across the country. That was driven by Girls for Gender Equity and the African American Policy Forum and Black feminists all across the country, calling for government, philanthropy, to make the same investment in girls of color that they are making in boys of color. Because it's way too often that Black girls specifically and girls of color have to wait for Black men and boys of color to get what they need, and then we can get what we need. And we're always seen as an afterthought. So this was a campaign that really, wanted to flip everything on its head. And like, we actually can't wait. We can't be considered as an afterthought. Like Black boys and, boys of color can't get what they need. And then we have to wait and get whatever's left. So Why We Can't Wait launched. We were able to partner with our New York City government here and stakeholders that were dedicated to Young Women's Initiative and centering girls of color voices in policy. and in philanthropy. And through that, we partnered with our city council here in New York City. At the time, we had our first Latina public speaker in the city council, Melissa Margvitero, who supported and helped us, bring this inaugural Young Women's Advisory Council to launch in 2015. And through that, we were able to launch our Young Women's Initiative from the first inaugural YWAC group who were leading policy.
And so that YWAC is our Young Women's Advisory Council, which also has launched a national Young Women's Advisory Council. And we have two members of that council, and that's Evie Sandrate and Rai Gesase. So would you just briefly introduce yourself, because we'll have some time to learn a little bit more about your YWI experience. Evie?
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Evie, and I was part of the National Young Women's Advisory Council for a year, and I was in the Dallas Young Women's Advisory Council for a year and a half. I'm currently pursuing my MBA, Master's in Business Administration at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and I work for Liberty Mutual. I'm in the catastrophe department there, and I look forward to share more today.
Excellent, thank you. And Rai?
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you for having me. My name is Rai, and I am from Minnesota's Young Women's Initiative of Minnesota. I have been a member of YWI for 5 years. So I was actually the longest standing member of the Minnesota YWI. I'm a recent graduate of Hamline University. I studied public health and political science. Currently applying to law school for next fall. And my current work actually right now is with Ignite National. Ignite is a national nonpartisan organization that's building a movement of young women from coast to coast who are going to be the next generation of political leaders. I train women to run for office every single day. And I saw that this was the natural extension of the work that I did with YWI, because I noticed in conversation with elected leaders, of which I'll talk about soon, is that we have a severe deficit of young women of color in office, and we need to fix that. And that's where I saw my passions and my work.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. Tony, thank you for that description of the work that GGE did and how that transitioned into the Young Women's Initiative. The Young Women's Initiative has some, as a model, has some components. Can you talk about a couple of those components and why they are so important for each of the initiatives throughout the states and the collaborative?
Yeah, so some of those, I'm guessing you're asking about the specific,
like the YWAC, a community partner.
Right. Okay, I'm sure that's what you're talking about. Yeah, so the model consists of, we have our community partners who are the community-based organizations that are really on the ground, leading policy, civic engagement work with young people. They are the ones who, in my opinion, they have their finger on the pulse of their communities. They're supporting young people on the ground. They're facilitating programs. They are the heart of the Young Women's Initiative, in my opinion. And then we have our philanthropy. We have the foundations who, of course, are supporting the work that the community organizations are doing. And then we also have government and and local electeds and officials that we are working alongside. For example, we have a lot of YWACs who are partnering with their city council folks. We have some who are even in cabinets with their mayors and senators for their local localities. So it's essentially YWAC and YWI calls for a bridge and a connection between public and private sector. So there's always a community partner, there's always a foundation, and there's always partnership with government.
Excellent. And the initiative members, we all agree on certain pillars, such as we're all having a Young Women's Advisory Council. We're all going to have a community partner. In Dallas, our community partner is the North Texas Alliance to Reduce Unintended Pregnancy in Teens. And yet we all meet our geographic needs differently. But we all have a similar experience and we all have some similar outcomes. Evie, can you share with us what prompted you to join the Dallas Young Women's Initiative, which is a very locally focused initiative? And what did you do in your meetings? What kind of speakers did you have? How did you interact and work with Interrupt?
Yeah, what prompted me to join, I knew a fellow member and she told me about the work they did, and I was really interested because um, I grew up in Dallas. I went to Dallas schools, and I always felt like there was a gap for programs for young women of color in the education I received. And so I joined to be able to help in that aspect and focus. I joined on the education group. Our meetings were monthly. So we met monthly in person at a Dallas office, and we connected through an online platform called Basecamp throughout the week. And uh, we talked about things that we could do to help young women of color in our city. And Interrupt, the community partner, they were like our guides, like our big sisters. And, they helped us develop our next steps and what we would do. And so I really appreciated them. They were a big help in our Dallas YWAC.
Excellent. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on. Rai, the YWI program in Minnesota is a statewide program, very, very different. And tell us about what prompted you to join and the selection process. And as a statewide program, how did you collaborate across an entire state?
Yes. So yeah, YWI in Minnesota is a statewide initiative. I always like to begin by saying that the former CEO of the Minnesota Women's Foundation, Lee, walked into the governor's office one day with a huge proposal for them. And her proposal was, I need you all to invest in young women, and I want you all to create a cabinet where you center young women's experiences and the work that you all do. Lee tells us she walked into that meeting expecting a no, and she walked out with a yes. And this yes was from former Governor Mark Dayton. And he set an example. I truly believe he set an example for what governors all across this country should be doing, and is to include young women in decision making on all aspects of policy, because we know that women's issues and young women's issues aren't a singular, we're not a singular, issue area, but really like it's all policy impacts women and young women and girls and gender expansive folks. So women and young women and gender expansive folks need to be present at all of those decisions. So he said yes. And I actually had a conversation with him where he's like, I actually read through every single one of your applications. And that is a testament to his commitment to this work beyond just, the symbolic gesture, but actually committing to learning about learning about the experiences that I personally had and my peers have had in the state of Minnesota. So the reason why I applied is in junior year of my high school career, I launched my high school's first ever Students for Social Justice Club. I grew up in predominantly white schools, and as I was finishing up my high school career, there was a lot more students of color that were looking for a space that we could talk about what we experienced growing up in this community. So I launched this club, and it eventually obviously got me recognized by folks who are running YWI, and which is the reason why I applied. So I was formally appointed in 2016, and I've been serving as a member ever since. I actually just finished up my last year as a term. So I am officially an alumni of the Minnesota YWI. And it has truly, truly changed my life, like in ways that I can't even describe in words. I went from being someone who was, a humble leader to someone who's confident, to someone who speaks about my lived experiences in a way that's compelling, in a way that, like my lived experiences are not trivial. They're actually a testament to the strength and the resilience of my people, of myself, and what I have to bring to the table. I'm so much more able to articulate this in ways that I never would have been had it not been for YWI and the consistent amount of support. So we met bi-weekly, and in the YWI in Minnesota, we're a statewide initiative, but we do foster relationships, and we do make sure that, because this is a public-private partnership, we do tap into the funders to fund work in a way that's accessible to all people. We have our indigenous sisters that are on our cabinet who live about 4 or 5 hours up north from where we meet, which is in St. Paul. And so the Women's Foundation of Minnesota knew that we're going to have to provide transportation, hotels, if we have a meeting, because we usually have our meetings in the evening. So offering those accessible outlets so young women who live far away can still come and meet. And then we've also been talking about how to, bring our meetings out to them as well. So
that's a great segue, because as our title of our session says, it's centering on young women of color. And going beyond the term of centering on young women of color, what does that look like in YWI? What does it mean? Tony, would you like to share a little bit about what does centering mean?
Yes. One of my favorite parts about YWI is our assets-based programming, which is highlighting the assets that young women bring to the conversation before we talk about the deficits, because we know that deficits are symptomatic of deficient systems and not deficient young women. Young women are leaders, and young women are full and whole, and we have systems that are not meeting their needs, which is why we need to focus on young women and the assets that they bring and how we can transform systems.
Excellent. And Edie, how do you feel that your experience in the YWI program in Dallas was centered on you as a young woman of color?
It was centered on me as a young woman of color because it focused on our needs. We met together with the council and we talked about what is needed in the city, where are there gaps, and there was a lot of them. And our experiences, what we went through, laid the foundation to our action items. What are we going to do to help others in our city? And the change and what we've done has been phenomenal. And like Rayi said, the confidence you gain, I would be scared to speak up, and now I know I can speak up and I have a voice. But because of the stuff we've learned and what we've been poured into us by our community partners, by the Texas Women's Foundation, and by the guest speakers we've had, has just been amazing. The education that we've gotten, learning about pronouns, which is something before the council that I didn't know. And, that has been eye-opening too. So many things has been centered on us and what can help us and our future, the generations to come.
Tony, do you want to expand on that? On what does it mean? How do you put centering into action?
Yes, that's actually one of the, I didn't get to talk about myself a little bit, but when I graduated social work school, I knew I wanted to be in a sphere and work in a community and an environment and work on policies and organizations that centered girls of color. So when I think of centering young women of color, this looks like specifically what it says. I think what YWAC and YWI does the best that no other initiative is doing is that they are calling for a government to bring girls of color into the fold, into policy. So when we say centering young women, when we say centering girls of color, it's not that, we have electeds who are just, just considering girls of color. We are saying we need girls of color at the tables. You cannot continue to make policies that directly impact their lives every day without them being there when you're signing these bills. They need to be there every step of the way, and they need to be more than considered. Considered is the bare minimum. They need to be sitting right by you, thinking through. You need to be in the spaces with them. You need to be considering their communities, their churches, their schools, their environments, their peers. And it's important that we remember that boys of color, while they're experiencing all these oppressions, we recognize that girls of color are in the same communities with them, in the same schools, experiencing the same things, if not more. So we have to make sure that that is being carried through when we think about policies, allyship, adult allies, all of those moving pieces.
And I think for us, since I'm in Dallas, I'll speak a little bit to the Dallas that, we evaluate our program, and we in Dallas, we focus, we partner with Southern Methodist University, their Center on Research and Evaluation, and they're not coming in to evaluate the program. They are working with our fellows, which we call in our council. They are working with the fellows to develop the tools, the survey tools, the mechanisms, the content, the questions. So what's that saying? Not about us, without us. You know, that is exactly what they are doing. So thank you very much. Amazing work that that everyone has been doing, and I'm glad it was such a wonderful experience for both of you. I'm going to go on to this next question because I think this is something that is so relevant to the theme of the conference today. You know, the women's foundations, the 9 that are participating in the collaborative, they trust that women are the experts. They're experts at identifying the changes that need to be made for a more equitable society. So we invest in the vision, we invest in the action collectively, individually, and the theme of this conference is equity in action. So let's talk about some action. Edie's, locally in Dallas, I know that this past year there was a focus on the census, and also that the Young Women's the council has funds which they determine how to grant out into the community to most impact young women of color. Would you share some of that with us?
Yes, of course. This was one of my favorite things that we did. So with the census, we started doing some things before pre-COVID, in person, attending parades, talking to our community, getting the word out, and then COVID hit. So we had to change strategy. So we did a social media campaign online to increase awareness, and talked about our experiences and why it's important, to fill out the census for a more equitable society. And we also published 5 articles in Visible magazine, as well from our fellow members, and that was to raise awareness. And additionally, what we did is we awarded grants to organizations in Dallas that focus on helping young women of color. We had a process. What did they do? We were investing in them, with the council. And so that was amazing because we got to help a lot of people while in COVID, and all virtually, and it didn't stop us. We kept going, and it was an amazing experience to be able to make a change, even while being at home.
And I'll add again, just being in Dallas, that those op-eds, they addressed serious situations. The resources for the LGBTQ community. They addressed immigrants and fear of the census. So all of that from that personal lived experience, for sure. Rai, as a cabinet that's appointed by the governor, you were at the table, at that decision-making table. Share with us, what were some of the items that were proposed, and what were some of the wins for young women of color in Minnesota?
Yeah, I do want to start, when you were introducing this question, this notion around young women are experts in their own lived experiences is I immediately think about this beautiful quote by our Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who says the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And that's truly emblematic of what we mean when young women are experts of their own lived experiences. Young women know what they need. Young women know what they need. And us as people with access to power, our jobs, our roles should really be about facilitating access to power so that they can determine what they need and when they need it and how they need it. So keeping that in mind, what we did in Minnesota is we work directly with young women. So not just the cabinet, but we're reaching out to young women who are not also at the table, not at the table with us, to bring them into communities. Because I know it's something that I personally do as a daughter of immigrants. I'm always like, when I enter the room, I have my hand held back and I'm bringing a whole group of folks behind me, because I know that it's not just about me, but it's about the foundation that I'm leaving for them and for the generations to follow. So some of the policy items that we've worked on a statewide level is we've advocated for driver's license for all. This is a bill that would allow undocumented immigrants in our state to get a driver's license for public safety. Other things that we've worked on is increasing the amount of teachers of color in our schools. Minnesota has one of the largest opportunity gaps in the entire country, and we believe that teachers of color are a critical component of being able to address this. Eliminating the statute of limitations on sexual assault cases. This is the one that we worked on just last year. And then one that I personally actually proposed and, wrote for the Minnesota House of Representatives is actually paid internship opportunities for young women of color interested in nonprofit, in business, in philanthropy. And the reason why I did this is because there is a lot of unpaid internships out there. And for young women, and especially, like, for example, for me as as the daughter of immigrants, I had so many household obligations that I had to do, whether it was taking care of my brother or, doing other things where 10 hours that I could work at an internship, for me, I would have to work getting paid. So like for an internship wasn't feasible. So I proposed this bill because I knew that this wasn't only my story, but this was the story of young women all across our state. And it was important that if we actually valued the work that the value that the contributions that young women make, then we should also pay them accordingly. So yeah, we worked on a whole host of things. And as you can see, they're not only issues that are traditionally considered women issues or young women issues. And I always emphasize this, but every issue needs a gender lens, a gender and a racial lens. And that's how we approach our work. And that's how we selected the items that we have advocated for.
Excellent. And I was going to mention, Evie, in Dallas, there was one of the grants that was made was to the Parkland Hospital. Talk about a system. Talk about some influence into a big system. You want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was a grant where to Parkland Hospital, and they made a brochure, and what we wanted to focus, especially for women and young women of color, it was a brochure on menstruation for women, and it's Spanish and English. And I saw the final copy of the brochure, and it's beautiful. There's a brown young woman of color in the front page. To help others, because we noticed that there's a gap in our communities and our families, and that educate young women of color on things like menstruation, their bodies, and things like that. And so we were able to partner with Parkland on the design on what was going to be on that brochure. And now that brochure is out in Parkland. It has been finished, and it was amazing to be part of that, because we know that next time a young woman or somebody that identifies as a young woman goes into and picks up that brochure, we were part of that, and it'll help them. So it was a great experience.
So Tony, taking all this momentum from all the local councils and cabinets, and the first year of a national Young Women's Advisory Council, what were some of the action highlights on a national level?
Yeah, so last year we actually kicked off our first ever national YWAC cohort in Atlanta, Georgia at the National Crittenton Conference, which is a conference that centers girls of color and their leadership in policy work. We kicked off with a group of 24 young people, 3 representatives from each current YWAC locale. And they were able to come together to share their shared policy goals, what they envision for themselves to live self-determined lives in this country. And the 6 policy points that they were able to cultivate together, we then were able to take and create a national agenda. And right now, the big momentum that we are driving nationally in collaboration with YWI is the national agenda for Black girls, which is the 6 policy priorities that we've taken from our meeting last February and expanded into a larger framework of what does it take and what does it look like for an election to happen right now, and for a person to, take the highest seat in our country. And we're essentially saying you can't have the highest seat as president in our country if you're not doing things and you're not promoting policies and, creating systemic change for Black girls, girls of color, and gender expansive youth. It's just impossible, right? And in 2020, this being such a critical year, I think National YWAC's really pivotal accomplishment was being able to take something like that and create a policy priority document where we were able to use that and hand out presidential questionnaires to folks who are running for president back in February. We've been able to hold specific meetings. This week we held a candidate forum with the only group that responded to our invitation, Team Biden. in a 501c3 capacity, but just thinking about the ways that National YWAC's leadership has seeded and allowed something to expand into what it is now. And we are currently recruiting for our second cohort of National YWAC, and we're looking forward to doing even more large things with this upcoming cohort.
Excellent. I want to bring this kind of to Texas, to point on Texas. Why this is just so important, because just FYI, 68% of young women in Texas between the ages of 15 and 24 are young women of color. So when you hear about all the influence, all the action items, all the change that these young women have created, it is absolutely amazing. So we're nearing kind of the end here, but I feel like, as a foundation member, that return on our investment in young women has been amazing. It's one of the best investments that we can make. And these smart, these powerful, these energized young women, they're guiding our future. And so with an eye toward the future, I want to ask you to take a little time and share with us, how has being part of this local and national council had an impact on your future plans? Rai?
Yes. So YWI has greatly shaped not only the trajectory of my professional life, but also my academic life. It was because of YWI, it gave me the courage to, so I just go rewind for a little bit. I actually wanted to go to medical school, and I was a biology major my first year, and I hated those classes, to be honest. And it was because of the confidence that I gained through YWI that allowed me to pursue the path that I was actually passionate about and I was actually really good at, which is why I studied public health and political science. Now I've graduated with both my degrees in those fields, and now I'm pursuing law. And, law seems like the natural extension of the work that I've already done, because I've seen that law impacts our life. But most importantly, I've actually learned that law not only shapes our society, but we can shape it too. We have the power to let laws dictate us and govern us, and how that gets done. So because of that, I'm pursuing a law degree. I currently work with Ignite National as a Midwest program manager. And my goal is, with a law degree in the future, I'm able to better elevate the work and the movement building work that I've been doing for the past, 5 years now. And that, for me, I wouldn't have been able to pursue this path had it not been for YWI. It's really given me the confidence to articulate my lived experiences, like I mentioned before, in ways that are transformative, not only for myself, but for my community as well.
Wow, excellent. And Eves, what has been part of this, not just the local, but also the national council?
It has had a great impact on me as well, too. I want to rewind as well. When I started YWAC, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to business school. And with the support system, the network, the connections, we got to meet so many women of color in leadership in Dallas. And I got that confidence, to go to business school, of my choice. And happy to say that at the end of this year, I'll be starting my own nonprofit. I don't think that's something that I would have had without the support system and the education that I received while being part of the YWAC and the national YWAC in Dallas as well. And I'm so excited, for the future, to help others and to continue with this passion to help young women of color as I go. So I'm so thankful for the community partners, for Tony as well. She was our community partner national, and for Mary.
Oh, well, thank you. And Tony, what do you see for the future? What are the plans for the National Young Women's Advisory Council with a year under its belt? And what are some of the goals for the coming year? What kind of impact are we looking for on a national level?
Yeah, I can totally answer that. I wanted to do a bit of a backpedal
Sure.
just really quickly
We have some
with my
time.
previous question. I didn't provide you all space where you can check out more of what National YWAC and the National Agenda for Black Girls are leading, but please check out blackgirls2020.com for much more information on the work that young people are driving across this country. But yes, to talk more about the future, right? What this will look like this year, with all that we are up against COVID-19, the racial uprisings across our country, we are recruiting a cohort of National YWAC members that are ready to lead the research work, that are ready to lead and partner with policy partners to lead town halls and just provide us in the space where girls of color are telling us right now their immediate needs in these specific moments, whether it's the economic crisis, their trauma and support needs. We are just looking for a group of young people who are ready to not only take action, but that we can also support, understanding that this is a time where young people need our support from community partners, philanthropy the most. So in the past few months, we've been leading Girls of Color town halls all across this country and gathering young people to identify their policy needs, their immediate needs, and in a more preventative and harm reductive way. And I'm looking into the future, just thinking about expansion, continuing to expand our YWI model. We're in conversations with folks in Miami, Colorado, some folks in the Midwest, to really see what synergy we have and really think about how we can continue to create the world that girls of color deserve.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. There were two different mentions, and I wanted just to go back to those before we close, if I could. And that is, I think, Edie, you mentioned just having access to speakers and having access during the meetings. Can you share with us, was there any one particular speaker that stood out to you at one of our meetings, and why?
Well, I loved all the speakers. I think everyone we brought was phenomenal. I think an impactful speaker was Marty McDonald. She's the CEO of Boss Women Media, and she talked about her experience in being a Black woman in corporate America, which I relate to as I work in corporate America right now, and how she transitioned to being an entrepreneur and CEO of a company. And it was just so transforming because she gave us tips to, make following our dreams, that we can do what we can accomplish. And for me specifically, finding that voice in corporate America, I'm involved with a lot of groups at Liberty to make sure diversity and inclusion is number one important in our company. I actually got the diversity inclusion award because everybody knows me as a diversity inclusion person, because that's something I always advocate for. We didn't have any leadership that were people of color, so that's something that I brought to their attention, and we're working towards that. And Liberty is a great company that allows you to develop that, but Marty McDonald just tied that piece together. Also, I got the opportunity to meet Elaine Welteroth. She's the author. Yeah, she's amazing. I got to interview her with another of the fellows and speak to her, and it was just really amazing because I don't think I would have gotten that opportunity anywhere else. And her book too, definitely recommend it to anybody. It's called More Than Enough. Amazing book for young women of color as well.
Great. And Rai, I had another thought as both you and Tony were speaking. You mentioned that you're always reaching back and pulling people along with you. And we talk about that a lot here in the Dallas council meetings. And then Tony mentioned, 501c3, but y'all do something unique in Minnesota. And that is that you grant to individuals who may not be a 501c3, individuals who are changing narratives and changing systems. Is there a particular grant that you made that stands out for you, and why?
Yes. So yeah, in Minnesota, we don't believe that only 501c3s are the ones that are capable of moving us forward. We actually believe that when we invest directly into the hands of young women, they are best able to use that money to bring about the change that they need. I'm actually a recipient of this. I'm actually going to be launching in just a few months now, starting in February, a program that's going to be centered on young women, and especially young women of color, to gain the tools that they need to run for office in the near future. So I'm hoping to get women who are anywhere between the ages of 20 to 30 to sign on and come and join me as I train them on what they need to know, all of the paperwork, all of the, I think oftentimes in the electoral space, people are like, young women are not electable, and young women of color are not electable, and whatever else is said about that. My goal is to dismantle that entirely and equip young women to use their lived experiences to propel them into office, because we need them, and they are the best positioned people to lead us into the future.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. Well, we've come to the end here, and I wanted to share, I think Tony shared with you some contact information, and I know that this has come up in other sessions, so if you have any questions about the Young Women's Initiative, feel free to reach out to me at the Texas Women's Foundation, txwf.org, and I will answer the question or connect you to the person who can best answer that question, whether it's here in Texas or California or wherever that may be. And with that, I will say that on behalf of the Texas Women's Foundation and the National Collaborative of Young Women's Initiatives, thank you to the panel for taking time out of school and out of work to be here today to share their experience. And thank you to all of you for joining us and listening. And I encourage you to be an ally to young women of color in our community. Thank you.